So welcome to winepilot.com today. My name's Angus, and today we are looking at some fantastic new releases from Terre, and we've got the winemaker with us, Xavier Bizot. But first, introduction of all the fantastic faces we have with us today. Andrew Pritzker, Master of Wine, great to see you. Mel Moore, formerly of actually still of Merivale Group, it must be said. Ken Gargett, of course, from Queensland. Tony Love, where are you tonight, Tony?
I'm in the Adelaide Hills.
Plain old Adelaide, lovely to see you.
Yep.
Shante Wong from Aria, I should say from Key Restaurant. How rude of me. We'll just cut that bit out. Obviously, we have the lovely Jenny Port as well from the lovely part of Melbourne, and Xavier Bizot, of course. So Xavier, please, let's start off. Tell us, I mean, obviously, it's a bit of a different vintage. It's a bit of change of direction, I think, from Terre. So please tell us all about it.
So just a few words first on Terre. So it's a relatively new winery so the wines we're going to taste today are based from our single vineyard, which is the Crayer Vineyard in Rattenbury, which is just north of Coonawarra in the Limestone Coast. We planted that vineyard in 2004, close spacing. So it's 8 hectares, close spacing, on rootstocks, very low fruiting wire. The density of plantation is 4,500 vines per hectare, but also it's very narrow rows, which is the important thing because that's when you manage to get the whole benefit of close spacing. And we've got 4 varieties in that vineyard: Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Shiraz. Terre also, we make a very good sparkling wine in Piccadilly Valley, but we're not going to talk about this today. But I just thought I'd mention Daosa, which is been very successful for us after 2 years of operation of that small high-end traditional method wine. So to come back to Terre, we actually this year with COVID-19, one of the benefits is we had a bit of more time to reflect on what we're doing and how we're doing it because of less investment in travel and also we had a slightly lower vintage, extremely good vintage in 2020 for us. We're very lucky, but much less wine because the yields were very low. And we just first realized that since 2008, we made 65 wines, which is quite amazing. We actually couldn't believe it, but we actually experimented a lot in the last 12 years, making different styles of wine, making using different winemaking technique, managing the vineyard differently. And I think we've basically come up with the idea that we had to simplify, and we had enough experience in the vineyard now to actually narrow it down to what we're making best. 2 things. The Sauvignon Blanc from the start, I think we had the right, should I say recipe, but at least interpretation of the vineyard. And the second thing is the use of Shiraz, which we have 1 hectare of in that vineyard, which we were making as a straight variety. And we realized that actually the best wines we made with Shiraz were in blends. So that's why we actually, in 2018, decided from the vintage 2018, only use Shiraz for blending. So all our reds from the vineyard now will have Shiraz as a blending component to give complexity, to give that Australian character to the wines, and to make the wine more interesting and more appealing to the consumer. So that's why we now have a Cabernet Franc Shiraz, where before we had a straight Cabernet Franc and a Shiraz. We have a Cabernet Sauvignon Shiraz, where before we had Cabernet Sauvignon 100%. Or 95%, we have a bit of Cab Franc in there. And then we in 2015, we started making that reserve wine, and we've been making it ever since. So I think that's a good introduction, enough information. Now the truth is in the glass. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the wines and at your disposal if you have any questions.
Perfect, Xavier. I mean, just one question. I mean, I think Rattenbury versus Coonawarra, what do you think are the key differences? Obviously, Coonawarra's got a fantastic history, and we're all very well versed, and the consumer's very well versed. Less so with Rattenbury, unfortunately. What do you think's the key? If you boil it down to a couple of things, what's the key difference between the two, do you think?
The first thing you have to understand is unique vineyard sites in the world haven't been built in one generation or two or three, but more like over centuries. Coonawarra, the first vineyard, was planted in 1891 by a pastoralist, John Riddoch, who was a very smart man and with lots of vision. But is it the best area for what we have in the southeast?
Yeah.
The future will tell. We don't know. I mean, but the thing is, the thing that's for sure is when you compare, Rattonbury is the same soil as Coonawarra. So it's the same idea. Basically, Coonawarra is based on a high rising ridge, which in the southeast, all the southeast was marshes, basically before it was cleared for to put sheep and cattle and also cereals and crops. And the vineyard sites in Rattonbury are all the high-rising sites which are on Terre, which were too poor for anything else to grow, and that's where vines grows. And the thing is that they started in Coonawarra, near Penola and Coonawarra, but all those ridges, we have them in Rattonbury as well, and the same ones. And that's what Coonawarra realized in the late 80s, where they wanted to plant more vineyard outside of Coonawarra, and they looked at Rattonbury. And then in 1999, they wanted to restrain the GI, and then that's when Rattonbury had to find a name. But for me, and a lot of the growers will tell you that Rattonbury fruit is on average every year better than Coonawarra. It's riper, and but that said, you have some fantastic vineyards that are extremely good in Coonawarra as well. It depends. When you take Coonawarra as a whole, and the best vineyard in Rattonbury, we make better wine. Then the best sites in Coonawarra and the best sites of Rattonbury are, for me, similar and make similar wines. Probably more tannins in Rattonbury than in Coonawarra.
Yeah. Okay.
That's it.
Sounds good. So the first wine we have 2019 Sauvignon Blanc. I mean, for me, it's always been, I guess, one of my favourite Sauvignon Blancs. Really in Australia, I think, because of the complexity that comes from the winemaking as well. What do we all think of this particular wine?
I'll go with you as well. I'll follow quickly on that, and it has also been one of my favourite Sauvignon Blancs over the last 5, 6, 7 years or so as well. Coming from the Adelaide Hills, where you saw that region develop a style that was post-New Zealand in a sense, and then to see a wine like this that has so much more character and depth to it, and as you say, it's in the winemaking, a lot of it as well, but obviously that site and the length of ripening time and all the other things that go into it, I really have always loved that wine, and I do to this year as well. So I just think it's just got a lot more going for it, a lot more interest than your usual commercial punch in the nose kind of Sauvignon Blanc.
And Andrea, from a global perspective, how do you see this one?
Well, I think when I saw this wine, what struck me so much was the balance of the wine. And I think there's so much Sauvignon Blanc that's not balanced, that the acidity is too high, raspy and jutting out. And that's something I see a lot of in, obviously, New Zealand and certain other Australian producers. But it can also be a component in Sancerre. Sometimes the acidity is just out of whack. And here, I think with this wine, there's a beautiful balance, and there's a brightness and a freshness and a zesty intensity, which consumers expect of Sauvignon Blanc. It's one of the best sellers globally because of that bright, vibrant, forward fruit intensity. And this wine has that, but it also has some textural complexity and some great balance and more depth, as Tony said as well.
I mean, Shante, for this wine, in terms of, I love this wine as a food wine. I think in terms of its textural richness and its complexity. I mean, for you, at Key, this kind of wine, how does it sit within the kind of thing that you do every day?
Yeah, I mean, a style that has always stood out to me. I think, talking about having a little bit of time in the demi-muise, but also that little bit of lees aging. We talked about texture, but it's a wine that also ticks the boxes for a broader audience as well. So even though you've got these lovely ripe fruit characters, that lovely kind of acidity, I think it ticks a lot of boxes for people that want a complex Sauvignon Blanc, but also people that, you know, perhaps just want to order something that they can have on by the glass that matches with quite a few different items of seafood and things like that. So it's a very complex wine with lovely nuances, but at the same time, I love the ripeness that it has as well. It's not mean, it's not harsh, it's not too tropical. And like we said, that lovely kind of pithy texture that's built into the wine. Works for me.
May I ask a question also? Sorry, Ken, I just wanted to ask a question about, of Xavier more than anything, about, I mean, this is not a $20, you know, commercial Sauvignon Blanc. It's a Sauvignon Blanc that, you know, is double and a bit more that price in a sense. So what is the market like for, what is the consumer expectation of a Sauvignon Blanc that is at that price? I mean, is there a thirst for that kind of wine at that price?
So I made my life very hard. First, I'm based in Ratonbouille, so that's not easy. But then I make a top-end Sauvignon Blanc, which is even harder. But the thing is, you know, it's better to be have your own lane in a sense, and work. The problem of working in a bigger and you know, in the Chardonnay league or in the is that your wine can be often forgotten or not noticed, whereas because we're there's not many people who actually bother working with that variety for a lot of reasons, and mainly the fact that it's too commercial in the mind of people. And we have that vineyard, which is one of the best vineyards you can think of for Sauvignon Blanc. It's got the right aspect. It's cool, but it's not too cool. You can really ripen the fruit, get rid of the green characters, and make a really beautiful. The fruit is amazing when we pick it. The pickers actually take away some bunches back home for dinner generally, which I always noticed, which means that the fruit is delicious when it's picked, but it's which is where the fruit comes from. But in terms of sales, it's not easy, but it's fascinating to actually try to explain to people, well, think again if you think Sauvignon Blanc is bad. And I personally have been through the same process when I started, because I didn't like Sauvignon Blanc very much. There's a couple from New Zealand that I liked. But then I met Pascal Cottard in Sancerre, who imports his wines. And he showed me some wines from the 90s, which was just sublime. Just like for me, like Premier Cru Chardonnay from from Puligny, the very same texture. Of course, more in the limey and lighter and leaner style. But it's and that's when I thought, well, if they can do it, we can. I mean, it's very, it doesn't take much to convince people when you have a good product that they should buy it. It's a bit more hard work. So we are not following trends, but it's a fascinating experience. We've had very good response on the wine over the years. Sometimes we have to do some deals in airlines to move some stock, so we did that a couple of times, but it's generally going in business or even first class. And the last time we did that, we had a panel of French sommelier and tasting the wines, and actually they loved it. And so it's a fascinating variety, Sauvignon Blanc. I think it's not fashionable, but if you make it well, it's a world-class wine. It's really up there in terms of quality. I think for me, it's halfway between Riesling and Chardonnay in terms of texture, fruit, intensity, elegance, sharpness, of acidity, etc. So it's a really fun wine to make and to sell actually as well.
My question was actually going to be very similar to that, except I was going to ask Shante and Melissa, do they get any resistance? I mean, I think it's 50 in a retail, I don't know what that would be in your restaurants, but it would be a fair bit more than that, I assume. Do you get resistance for a Sauvignon Blanc at that price, or is it hard to sell in your restaurants?
I think certainly for me, I find that with Sauvignon Blanc like this, that is of quality, like Cotap, for example, or Sancerre, or for wines like I'm thinking of, really premium things. I think people understand it. I think the days of people ordering Sauv Blanc as the sort of common or garden drink have kind of been replaced by rosé. I think people expect probably rosé in restaurants now to be kind of cheap and cheerful. Whereas I find certainly in the restaurants that I tend to work in, that people are kind of seeking out wines that they don't mind spending the money as long as the quality's there, And Sauvignon Blanc is no exception, especially with these wines. I mean, Terre's had a long history with Merivale. We've been, very excited supporters of the wines, and I think the price really, people are starting to realise that it's not about the price, it's about the quality, and they know the wines now.
So the next wine we're going to talk about is going to be the Terre, the Crayer Vineyard Cabernet Shiraz. I should say Cabernet Franc Shiraz. Mr. Ken from Brisbane. How do you see? Cabernet Franc. Xavier said earlier, Sauvignon Blanc's a bit difficult to sell. I think probably potentially Cabernet Franc is as well. How do you see this particular one?
Yeah, I actually thought this one was reasonably good value, more so compared to the Sauv Blanc. I thoroughly enjoyed this. It's got lovely aromatics, that sort of dark berry, dry herbs. There's sort of a little bit of sappy, dry vegetation through it. Fine tannins. It's got decent length. Some bright berries, some red fruits towards the end, cherries. I thought it was a lovely drink.
And in terms of Cabernet, do you see this as, what does this tell you about Cabernet Franc from Rat and Bulli, do you think?
I've got to base an opinion on Cabernet Franc and Rat and Bulli on one wine.
Well, no, but I think there's...
Based on this one wine, it would seem to have a future.
Yeah.
May I say a few points? Because we poured the straight Cabernet Franc for quite some time at Centennial in Wallara, and I was sad to see that the straight variety wasn't staying. However, I find in this wine, it's a lot more, to me, it seems to be a bit more serious. It's quite savoury as well. The Franc was never a big, ripe, sweet wine at all, but I see it kind of, the structure is changing quite a bit and becoming definitely more of a food wine. I think that these wines also, I think we spoke about the wines, Angus, you and I, about having them open a little bit of time, but certainly as a pourer, we used to pour the wines by the glass and they would be great the next day or the day after even, I like the change of style. I think it's really lovely.
How about you, Jenny?
I love Cabernet Franc, and I have been a big fan of Cabernet Franc from that area, and what Xavier's father-in-law has also been pursuing with Cabernet Franc over the years. I think it's just the most glorious, beautifully lifted, scented wine. You just want to put it under your nose and leave it there. So I really like that wine, and I do like that price. I really like that price. I think that is excellent value right there.
Well, what you said, Melissa, that really rings true to me, what you said about that particular one, because that Cabernet Franc before Xavier was so pretty and perfumed and cranberry and raspberry, and it had all those classic like Anjou-like kind of characters. But this one's actually quite different. Like the Shiraz has actually added a real back into this particular wine. I think it's really given it some oomph and potentially some more character for an Australian audience. Potentially, like you kind of talked about earlier, Shiraz being the local flavour in some ways, and I'd really see that in this wine. You have the Cabernet Franc, you have that graphite-y fruit, but at the same time you have some good blackberry, spicy, tannic richness behind this wine. So I think this will actually probably, while maybe not as pretty now as some of those Cabernet Francs were when they were on release, it actually probably has a lot more potential for aging.
I find it an interesting development in terms of Xavier's development of the Cabernet Shiraz genre as something that he sees that vineyard is that he's going to specialise out of that vineyard. Now, there are any number of Cabernet Sauvignon Shiraz blends, I don't remember Cabernet Franc. I don't remember seeing any Cabernet Franc Shiraz blends. So I just wonder whether this is something even, something quite unique in terms of seeing this particular blend develop into something quite unique from that vineyard, on top of the other ones that we are going to talk about a bit later. So Xavier, is that something that you see? Have you had a reaction to that as well? Like Cabernet Franc and Shiraz, what the hell is that,
I think the way I'm going to make it is the Cabernet Franc Shiraz. The Cabernet Franc will always be the dominant part of the blend, especially as we're making it now. In 18 we didn't, but in 2015 we've added stalks to the Cab Franc. And as you know, stalks with red variety, when the stalks are ripe, they don't add green characters, but they lift and strengthen the fruit and the floral characters. That's what you get in Pinot. And in 2020, we've added stalks in the Cab Franc again, just a small amount, and that will reinforce the Cabernet Franc character in the blend. But I think, as we said a couple of times, Tony, I think the Cabernet Franc, like the Cabernet Sauvignon, needs a bit of help, and that's what they've done in Bordeaux. If you want to do a serious, a fine wine, if you want to do a regional wine, or like a Loire or Cabernet Franc on its own makes beautiful wines, and we've proven we can do that in that vineyard. But I think adding Shiraz or adding Merlot, like Brian does in the Wellburn Vineyard for the Cabernet Franc Merlot, or Merlot Cabernet Franc, depending on the year, is really makes it shines even more. It's and coming back on the variety in Ratonbully, when Brian did the first vintage of the Wellburn Vineyard with the 4 varieties he had: Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Shiraz, and Cabernet Franc. And he sent them back to Lange, who was at the time a partner in Tapanapa, for them to taste. Both Jean-Michel Caz and Daniel, the winemaker, said the best component was Cabernet Franc. That was the one that was really shining for them, and quite specific, and had the most character. And we've planted the vineyard in the Crayer was partly with a French clone, but also partly with one of the Wellburn clone, cuttings from Wellburn. And it's a really good, I think it has to do with the limestone, same as in the right bank in Bordeaux, which has a lot of soils are clay over limestone. And the limestone enhances the aromatics. And Cabernet Franc is a very aromatic and floral variety, perfumed, and that it's really enhanced down in the southeast. And the thing is, what we're just trying to do is we've done that style of wine, straight Cab Franc, for a couple of years. The thing I was disappointed was the palate, the tannins. And we're just trying to complement it with Shiraz to make it even better as a variety, as a wine. And we just started to release it, so we'll see what happens. But the previous wines we're making, the Ratonbully Red and then the Rouge from the vineyard were Cabernet Franc Shiraz, and they always were selling really well. So I'm quite hopeful that it will be well received. And I think even more when people see on the label what the varieties are. And
so can I ask a question? So you've made a bit of a statement with your pricing of these, because the Cabernet Sauvignon Shiraz is about 50% higher than the Cabernet Franc. Is that just because that's what you think the market will bear, or is there a reason for it? You think the Cabernet Sauvignon Shiraz is that much better, or?
So the answer is in the age of the vine. It's a very good question. So the Cabernet Franc were planted in 2008, and the Shiraz as well. The Cabernet Sauvignon was planted in 2004. The Cabernet Sauvignon vines are older, but I think the view I have on that vineyard is, as it ages, the prices will fluctuate and evolve. But at this stage, I think it's a fair price, and I don't want to make my life impossible either, too many expensive wines. So I think, as you said, it's really good value, and I'm very happy with it. And I think you have, when you have a quirky wine like that, that's not, first it's Ratonbouly, second it's Cab Franc, and then it has Shiraz. we will have lots of challenges already, so I don't want to add the price to it as a challenge as well. But I think it's a good introduction to the next blend, Angus, to Cab Sauv Shiraz.
So the next one we're going to have a look at is the Terre Crayer Vineyard Cabernet Shiraz from 2018. Jenny, port. I mean, obviously Cabernet Shiraz, it is the Great Australian Blend. It's really what we do. How do you see this wine, and how do you see this wine, I guess, comparing to the, what are some pretty amazing wine styles?
Well, first of all, I think it is a Great Australian Blend, and I don't know how many Australian-born producers are taking it as seriously as they might. Sales aren't that good, I think, for that category. They've been going down since the heydays of the 80s, the late 70s and 80s. So first up, I'm so impressed to see a French-born winemaker taking to the style and elevating it. I mean, I think that has to be acknowledged, and congratulations on that, Xavier. I'm just so thrilled, as someone who loves this style, to see someone taking it so seriously. And interestingly enough too, that there is 1% of Cabernet Franc in this blend. And I think you've just explained earlier why that is, but I was pondering that point when I was tasting it. And then I thought, well, immediately it contributes to those lifted aromatics. I mean, this is another lovely example of just the beautiful aromatics rising from the glass. And then I thought, again, true to style, at least true to the style that I like, this is fruit-led. This is all about the fruit. It's the most glorious, ripe, sweet, to a degree, fruit. And it's a celebration of that. And again, that is how I see this style too. And then I looked at the vintage, the 2018, which Xavier has already noted was warmer than usual. So ripeness is certainly clearly on display here. And I think it is too in that 14.5% alcohol. Not that I have a problem with it, but it is of a higher alcohol for some of these wines, and it is of the more generous school from that point of view. And I think in turn that has also inspired the winemaker to use that 21% new French oak, which is considering what he normally does, I would have thought that was on the slightly more generous end. But again, the fruit is up for it, slurps it right up, no problem there with balance from my point of view. This is an unrestrained, which I quite like too. That's so Australian. Buoyant wine, full of black fruits, red fruits, and I like that little bit of pomegranate tartness too, and the spice rising from the glass. So I think I've written here that the palate was well meshed, almost voluptuous by hill standards. I think if you were given this wine blind, you might actually wonder whether this is indeed from the Adelaide Hills. We're used to more structure, more fineness. This is breaking out of that kind of jacket a little bit, I thought, and I am in favour of it. It is an expression of the year as much as anything else, as well as Xavier's plans for this style. I loved it.
It's quite savoury too. It's quite like, look at the 389. Obviously the signature kind of thing, some other really good examples of it. It's got that Ratonbouly, ironstone, whatever, hemoglobin kind of taste to it. There's that savory, irony kind of taste to it, that masculinity to it that I like.
And
now,
I didn't mention that the drinkability right now, and that is something that we can talk about with the reserve. But this is right now, you can get into it, which again is something I applaud.
This was my favourite wine for drinking now, of the lot. What do you reckon, Mel?
I was lucky enough to see this about 7 weeks ago or so, and I think the purpose I heard that Xavier decided today was better as the wines had settled a little bit. And I did find both this wine and the next one very different today. I absolutely agree with Jenny on I love that buoyant fruit description. That was really great. But I did find that sort of Amaro bitterness in a good sense on the palate at the end, which I love. It's like a refreshing, a sip. It means you want to have another go. I love the wines. They're really great. But I love sort of the Cabernet dominant as well. I love that leafiness. And all those things, the spiciness. I thought it was beautiful. Yeah.
It's a really harmonious blend, and I think sometimes with Cabernet Shiraz, you see Cabernet and then you see Shiraz, and you don't necessarily see them meshing together. And this wine is fully integrated. I thought the tannins were pretty plentiful and shows great potential for a long life ahead. And yet, as Jenny and Melissa have pointed out, there's that voluptuousness and that generosity in the mid palate in particular, which I personally associate with Rattenbury actually. And I think that actually gives it immediate street appeal, immediate drinkability, and yet it has great potential for cellaring. So I think it's an excellent value, and it will find a very happy market.
So the last wine we're going to look at today is the Crayer Vineyard. It's the reserve. Xavier, do you want to give a little introduction to this? Because it's a big change in style.
So the reserve is it's the best wine we'll make every year from that vineyard, which will always be a blend of the three varieties. It will always have a lot of new oak, but for a limited period of time. The way we make those reds is we age them for the first a year in barrels, and mostly old, but some new, and the new is used for the reserve mostly, and a bit with the Cab Sauv Shiraz. And then we rack them off lees to foudre, so 4,000 litre barrels, old barrels, where the oak's supposed to be integrated. There's a very slow oxygenation as well of the wine before it's bottled. The reason we do that process is the way the vineyard is planted and the bunch exposure we get from the close plant spacing, we get more tannins. And actually, as I'm talking to you, I just received a report from the AWRI we did a tasting yesterday with Tony, Nick Ryan, Tim White in Adelaide with some of the best, all the best Cab Shiraz in the country at the moment. And there were 14 wines. And apart from the Penfolds, from probably some obvious reason, we have the highest tannin level in all the wines, including, some of the wines that are $350 or $400 a bottle. Mm-hmm. In all our three wines. And that's why we always knew that. We always knew there were lots of tannins. I can actually taste the tannins before vintage, before we harvest. I can taste that very dark, chocolatey fruit character of tannins. And that's why we're using that process to try and integrate the tannins in, and also the oak in the wine before we bottle. The reserve for me is the 16 was just an amazing vintage. It was extraordinarily warm, like more than an average Barossa vintage for Coonawarra. So if you want to know how Cab Shiraz or Cabernet from Coonawarra would look like if it was on Terre over limestone, you look at 2016 Coonawarra wines and you have your answer. And but it's a beautiful year. Very challenging, but low yields, very ripe fruit. We harvested without any burnt, damaged fruit. It was quite clean, and we didn't have any raisins or any overripe fruit. And for me, I'm very happy with that wine. It's a wine that will last for a long time. It's still very young, still very compact, but it will. I'm hoping it will be very drinkable again in 40 years, and I'm hoping I'll be there to taste at that time as well.
I mean, I know Tony's a big fan of this particular wine. Tony, what can you say about this wine? And in terms of how do you see it against, other prestige wines in South Australia?
Yes, thank you. I mean, it was a really interesting tasting yesterday with those other, the 14 wines all up. The Cabernet Sauvignon Shiraz and the Reserve were both in that in different tiers. So this Reserve was in the top tier in terms of prices and kind of, I suppose, iconic kind of naming rights for some of the other wines. And I and several others in the group probably marked it as one of the 3 top wines in that area in that particular league. What I love about this wine is that, and I mean, it's got nothing to do with any of my knowledge of the technical side that Xavier was just talking about, but notes from 2 lots of tastings now talk heavily about the integration of the oak and the tannins and the concentration of the fruit, and they're the things that I look at separately on separate notes, separate books. Didn't have any reference points, just tasting, and they were blind. The second lot was blind. They were my notes. At the integration of and the tannins provide what I have described as an exact grip and tension that matches the concentration of the fruit. And to me, that was a really critical part of the structure of the wine, of the total pleasure of the wine. I love the fact that for me, this blend is at its best when you get that lift of beautiful Cabernet aromatics to start with. In this case, there can be all sorts of debate about the mint or the eucalyptal kind of character in it, which is obviously something that comes out of that southeast area fairly regularly. My notes are that there was a little subtle sense of that, but nothing overriding. But the extract and the concentration and the depth and layers of this wine, to me, it's really the thing that really gives it that reserve, special kind of nature that sits it above the others in the group and sat it up there with the best of the top tier of those other Cabernet Shiraz. I just thought it was really engaging. You could sit with it and go, and it developed in the glass. I think it became more and more engaging as the glass was exposed. And with that all in mind, I'm guessing it's going to last much longer than I'll ever live. And hopefully, Xavier, I have no idea how old you are, but it might go all the distance as well. But I just found it really, it just had this really evocative and really intense, for an intense wine, it was a really evocative wine as well. And to me, I loved it. I loved it.
How about you, Chantal? How do you see this wine?
Yeah, it's definitely a powerful wine. I think that all of Xavier's wines showcase that his consideration for longevity and ageability in terms of wines. I like that fact that you, Tony, you just mentioned that little hint of eucalypt. For me, it's a lot more of the wintergreen. It's this lovely, really pretty wintergreen element that I don't see so much as that kind of harsh eucalypt element, which adds to it, and very, very luscious on the palate. So I think a wine that's going to last a very long time, and stylistically a wine that people ask for as well.
I mean, I guess one thing worth opening up to everybody is, the oak in that wine. Like it's got a fair whack of oak. We actually don't see that many wines with that much oak these days. Andrea?
Well, I'm usually pretty sensitive to oak and pretty scathing of anything that's really heavily over oaked. So I don't have any complaints in my notes here. So the fruit intensity and concentration clearly balance that oak regime, and the oak regime is clearly justified here. I think the one thing I do see, and it's probably just where it's at in its evolution, is the finish is quite drying. And that's obviously because of the tannins and the oak. And I've sort of written a note saying, with some additional time, that's probably going to evolve. It's also the style of wine that you tend to have with, a beautiful meal where the tannins aren't going to be as prominent as they are on my dining room table right now. But at that reserve level, often I have seen a lot of over-oaked wines or wines that are being masked by their oak regime, and I don't see that here.
No, it kind of has a claret-like edge to it, doesn't it? It has a, it really has a claret kind of structure and claret, class growth, classy oak kind of pizzazz to it. I think that particular wine.
Angus, you asked for some notes the other. I opened them a day or two ago, and I probably gave them an hour or so before I looked at them. And this was my pick of the wines, but only marginally above the previous wine. 24 hours, 36. There was a much bigger gap between the wines. And that was after I'd sent you the notes, which is a bit unfortunate, I suppose. But it had improved. And I'm just thinking, one of the things that I wondered about is you've got it under cork, and it just seems a completely different style. That brightness and freshness that you get in the first three wines, I didn't see. I saw other things, but I didn't see that. And I mean, is this a marketing thing? I mean, I know cork's been done.
No, it's not marketing. It's actually, we actually bottled that wine. We knew we were going on the cork. We bottled that wine on the cork, on the Diam, the new Diam origin, I think it's called, which is a natural kind of wax they use as a glue, so it's not chemical. And then we had some bottled as well on the Stelvin. We've been tasting that wine every 3 months. The first 3 months, I was going Stelvin, hands down. Abandoning cork and Diam, and that was it. And that was because we were going to get ready for the next vintage to be bottled. 6 months after was Diam, which actually was quite winning the contest. And then on the first day, and then the second day, we tasted the 3 wines again with the Diam, the cork, and the Stelvin. And basically, tasting it in a good way means not tasting on the bench, but at home and coming back to the wines and tasting without thinking about it too much. The wine that actually won was the cork. And because it actually, the Stelvin is good to retain the fruit and the freshness, but the cork for those complex wines which have drying tannins on the finish, they're quite complex, they're big wines. The very slow oxygenation is very good for the wine. And Brian has done that experiment. That's why he's using cork for his Pinot, and he would use cork for his Chardonnay if I wasn't stopping him. But it's the cork is you have to use the good ones, and we're using a very good one, which is the Massilva, which is tested for TCA. And the larger diameter corks, which actually have less chance to bleed, to leak. And but it's we think for the long run it's the best closure. And now, because of the problem the cork industry has in Australia, we can access the best cork, and they actually send you the best cork. So we've had so many issues in Australia, some of all those beautiful wines from the 80s and the 70s. They're all crumbly corks, so I don't think we'll have that issue. But it's commercially challenging cork in Australia, but that's why we're using it only for the top wines. If it was only me, I would use, and also there's also the economic consideration. It's quite expensive, but I would use it for the Cab Sauv Shiraz as well. But it's more commercially viable to use Stelvin. But it's I just wanted to reply to Jenny about the fact that I'm French and that I might surprise you even more. Is actually, I think, and especially after the tasting yesterday, I think if in South Australia mostly, and maybe parts of Western Victoria, we are more organized in the way we make those Cabernet Shiraz. And if there was more competition, and if there was more incentive for the top winemakers to make the blend, and as you said, if it was more commercially easy to sell, I think we would make wines that would be at the same level as First Growth. And I think it would be all First Growth level. It wouldn't be, some of the best. We have the best vineyard, some of the best vineyards in the world for Cabernet and Shiraz. I think a lot of winemakers are, and for a good reason, we make great Pinot, but are trying to, try to see the next generation planting new vineyards with new varieties, etc., which is all great. But they should also consider that to promote their country and their wine, that's the blend we should be making. And that's what we should be selling overseas. The only successful winery at the moment in Australia on export market is Penfolds. When I mean successful, it means selling at the highest price point consistently year every year in different countries, and people looking at it as they look at Bordeaux, they look at Penfolds like they look at Bordeaux, they look at Priorat, they look at all those Barolo, etc. And for one reason, is because most of their wines are Cabernet Shiraz blends. Even the Grange, and the Grange has a bit of Cabernet Sauvignon that makes a big difference, and the Saint-Henri as well. So I'm the biggest advocate to say that we should make more of this, and that top winemakers should be making more of those wines, and we would make fascinating wines. I mean, now and for the future.
Xavier, I think that's a fantastic place to finish. I think we're all in this group. I'm sure we're all massive fans of Cabernet Shiraz and see it as being really what Australia can do well. And I think we all commend you very much on those wines, and with some Cabernet Franc in there as well. So thank you, Xavier, very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Andrea, Mel, Ken, Tony, Shante, and Jenny, lovely to see you all talk about some wines. We'll do it again soon. Thank you.
Right. See you guys.
Bye.
Thank you.